Hello, thanks for joining us today. My name is Robert Lawson. I'm a professor in the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. I also direct the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom. I'm going to talk today about economic freedom and the wealth and health of nations. So we've been having a debate about economic freedom, capitalism, socialism, and concepts like that for a very, very long time. Two of my favorite scholars are Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Well, Adam Smith is one of my favorite scholars anyway. And there's a debate that these fellows have had, not directly with each other, but their adherents, their disciples, for going on 200 years, about how we should best organize our economy. What are the principles that we should use to do business and engage in trade with each other? My hero, Adam Smith, he advocated something called a system of natural liberty. Now, a system of natural liberty is not a term of art that we would use today a lot. It's a antiquated sounding term. Today we'd use a term like laissez-faire, free enterprise, free markets, private enterprise, or perhaps even capitalism to describe it. He uses this term called system of natural liberty. I think it's a nice sounding term, but it doesn't really ring very well in our modern ears. But what he meant by that is a system based on private property and self-interested people engaging in trade with each other to acquire the things in life that they want. He was a serious advocate of free trade in his era. He advocated that the English should be able to trade freely with the French, which was a crazy argument in his era. He argued for free markets in general. He was an opponent of labor unions, or what were more like guilds in the old days, and monopolies. He wanted to see an open, competitive, dynamic marketplace. And he had the argument in The Wealth of Nations that, well, the wealth of the nation would be higher, would be larger. The nation will be richer. People will be more prosperous if they have his system of natural liberty. So that was Adam Smith. He wrote in the late 1700s. In the middle part of the 1800s, a guy named Karl Marx comes along, and he criticized Smith. He criticized Smith and the various people who followed Smith, who thought Smith's ideas were good ideas. If you've studied any Marxian economics, you might know that Marx was a staunch critic of capitalism. He thought capitalism was going to be a bad system. He thought it was going to bring all kinds of negative consequences to people. It's going to bring poverty, business cycles, monopoly, exploitation of the poor. There's sort of a long list of things that Marx thought that capitalism would bring to the world that weren't nice things. And so what we have here is the two most important, towering figures in the history of economics. On the one hand, Adam Smith says, hey, free markets work well. And Karl Marx says, no, free markets don't work well. And in fact, according to Marx, free markets are going to work so poorly, they're going to work so bad for so many people that eventually the working class is going to rise up and violently overthrow their capitalist overlords. So it's a very strange system. We have this situation where we have these two great intellectual figures in economics saying two very, very different things. I would like to settle the debate, so to speak. I don't think we're going to settle the debate here and now, but I would like to move us along the way towards a settlement of the debate. And the way I'd like to do so is by injecting some data and some evidence into that debate. Because most of the debate about capitalism and socialism, Smith versus Marx, most of that debate is hotly ideological. There's a lot of heat, but there's not always a lot of light in that debate. So rather than argue for another 200 years about whether capitalism is better than socialism or socialism is better than capitalism, I would like to gather some data. And maybe the data will shed some light on this debate. So we're going to try to measure economic freedom. Now that's the term I'm going to use, is economic freedom. I'm not going to use capitalism or free markets or laissez-faire. All of those terms are fine, but the term that we like to use is economic freedom because I think it captures the essence of what Adam Smith was advocating. He advocated a system of natural liberty, a system where people were free to trade, free to start businesses, free to go into whatever occupation they wanted to go into. Freedom is the essence of Adam Smith's system. And we want to try to measure that. We want to try to put a number on it. Now, that sounds hard. Freedom and liberty, these are kind of fuzzy concepts. And indeed they are. But we measure things that are hard to measure and fuzzy all the time. If you've ever had a course in economics, you might know that GDP, gross domestic product. It's a measurement of the size of the American economy. Now, the American economy is an incredibly complex, massive thing. GDP includes everything from teaching economics lectures like this one, to people who make cars, to people that mow lawns. I mean, GDP is the single number that is trying to measure all of this stuff and put it down, boil it all down to a single number. So we measure complicated things with numbers all the time. So I want to try to do the same thing for economic freedom. So the essence of what I want to try to measure, though, is to what extent are people in different places. We're going to use countries as our main unit of analysis here. We're going to look at countries. I want to know, like, are people free to make personal choices about their economic lives? Can they decide what occupations they go to? Can they decide what jobs they take, what businesses they start? Are they free to trade with other people? Not just people in their own country, but are they free to trade with other people in other countries? So the freedom to trade, which was a core principle in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Can they engage in trade in a way where their property rights are secure? Right? Is private property secure? Are contracts enforced? Because if I'm going to trade with somebody, if you're going to trade with someone, you need to be able to enforce those whatever agreements you make in those transactions. So we're trying to put measurements on all these things. It sounds fuzzy and hard, but again, we do it all the time in many different other ways. So the Economic Freedom Index, or the Economic Freedom of the World Index, is something that I got involved with some 30 years ago when I was a graduate student, and I'm still working on it. And what we do is we gather data. We gather a whole bunch of data. We have 165 countries in our index. The index is now based on 45 variables. It's actually more than that, depending on how you count. So we have a lot of data. And we have data even back to the 1970s. So I've got data for the United States, for Venezuela, for India, for all these countries. And I have data on all kinds of different aspects of their economic systems, all the way back to the 70s until more or less the present. And the index itself has got 5 areas. And I'm not going to bore you with each of the 45 variables. We're just going to look at the 5 areas, the big areas. So the 5 areas are size of government, first of all. Now, how big? Like size of government, I mean like tax and spend. How much money should the government collect from people in taxes and then spend on government services? Well, it turns out we have some insight from Adam Smith himself. In The Wealth of Nations, there's a chapter on public finances. In that chapter, Adam Smith outlines what he thinks the government should tax and spend for. He says the government should have roads and bridges, schools, national defense, police, courts, and that's about the end of the chapter. If you compare Adam Smith's government, roads and bridges, schools, courts, cops, judges, national defense, it's a very small role for government compared to our government. The governments that we have in the United States do a lot more than that. We have recreation leagues, we have welfare spending, we've got Social Security, we've Medicare, Medicaid, the city of Dallas, where I live, owns a hotel. And again, there's nothing in Adam Smith's list of the Wealth of Nations says the government should be owning and operating hotels. So the government that we have in the United States is this big. The government that Adam Smith recommended in the Wealth of Nations is this big. So basically, for our purposes, we collect data on how big the government is in a tax and spend sense. And if you've got a big government in a tax and spend sense, you're going to get a lower rating. We're going to end up with a rating system, and the higher scores are going to go to the countries that are more like Adam Smith advocated in his so-called system of natural liberty. So the second area is legal structure and property rights. This is where we have this business about contract enforcement and so forth. So let me give you an example. The World Bank has a project called Doing Business, and in that project, they measure how long it takes to settle a contract dispute. So if you have a contract dispute with somebody, maybe you paid someone $1,000 to perform some service, and then they didn't perform the service. So you take them to court, you sue them. How long is it going to take to settle that dispute? Well, in the United States, I can tell you the World Bank estimates it takes about a year to settle a fairly simple contract disagreement in a court. And maybe in Texas, it's a little bit less than a year. Maybe in New York, it's a little bit longer, but about a year. It sounds about reasonable. In some countries, it says 5 years. In some countries, it says 5 months. So where are your property rights more secure? Where are you more secure in your property? Well, obviously you're more secure in your property if it only takes 5 months to settle a contract dispute versus 5 years. So we have data like that. We also have some data from survey questions on how impartial the judges are, because certainly you don't want to be in a court dispute with somebody, maybe a property dispute about who owns a particular tract of land, and you don't want the judge to be like related to one of the parties well, maybe if it's you would want that, but you wouldn't want the judge to be related to the person you're suing or you're engaged in a contract with. So we have a bunch of measures. Most of these are survey measures or things of that sort. I should also mention, it says it here, we actually do an adjustment now for how the legal system treats women vis-a-vis men. Most of the things that we measure in this economic freedom index are the same for men and for women. Like, it's not like tax rates are different for men and for women. So in area 1, where we were talking about government spending, we really don't have a male versus female tax rate. Everyone faces the same tax system. But when it comes to the legal system, you know, there are some countries where women are not allowed to sue men. They're just not allowed. Or they can, but they can only have a male relative do it for them. So your father or your husband would have to sue on your behalf if you had a dispute with somebody. So obviously women in many countries, their legal rights to have their property protected and their contractual relationships protected in court, the women are in many countries at a disadvantage. And we actually have an adjustment in this second area for that, and I'm very happy that we're able to do that. Now the third area is called access to sound money. You know, governments take money from us in many ways. They take money from us when they tax money. That was the first area. How big is the government? And people take money from you, like if someone takes $1,000 from you but doesn't perform the service, they're almost like a thief, right? So people can take money from you by welching out on their contracts. Another way in which your money can be taken from you is through inflation. What happens if you had a $100 bill and you put it in your wallet, and maybe you forgot about it? Maybe I used to do this when I was younger. I would put a $100 bill in some secret spot in my wallet, and then you'd wait, you know, just in case, like an emergency, if something went wrong, you needed a tow truck or something. So what happens if you hide a $100 bill, and then a year goes by and you find it? That's great, right? When you find some money that you squirreled away, and you take it to the store. You take that $100 bill to the store a year later. Well, we all know what the problem is. If inflation's been 5% over the course of that year, it's like someone took $5 out of your wallet. Now they didn't. I mean, it's still physically the same $100 bill, but the purchasing power of that $100 bill has gone down by 5%. It's like someone took $5 away from you. It's like a $5 tax. And monetary economists talk about inflation like it's a tax. It's called the inflation tax. Anything that you have that's got dollar bill amounts written on it, like mortgages, leases, insurance policies, bonds. There are lots of things we have in our economy that have dollar amounts written on them. All of those types of assets can be taxed away. The value of those assets can be taxed away via inflation. So, you know, we have a measurement here of inflation and some other things related to the stability of the monetary system. Because people, if they're economically free, if they're living in an Adam Smith system of natural liberty, they need to be able to store their money. Like the money you save in your bank account today, 10 years from now should be worth pretty much what it's worth, you know, when you saved it for the first time. Now the fourth area is far and away the thing I think we should identify most with Adam Smith. If there was one thing Adam Smith was doing when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he was writing a grand plea to his countrymen in Britain to trade freely with other countries, especially with France. He was a free trader. So the fourth area is freedom to trade internationally. In this area, we measure things like tariffs and quotas. We get data from the World Trade Organization on these things. So, you know, what's the average tariff rate on imported goods and things like that. We also have some measures here on capital controls. Governments restrict the flow not only of goods and services across countries, they also restrict the flow of investment from country to country, capital controls. So this is an area where if you want a good score in this area, you're going to be a country with low tariffs and low quotas and not a lot of capital controls. And then the last area in the index is freedom from regulation. And it's a hodgepodge of different things. We have some measurements here in the financial markets like interest rate controls. Now, we don't have interest rate controls in the United States anymore, although we used to. When I was a child, we still had some interest rate controls. But many countries still regulate the interest that banks can either charge or pay on, say, like savings and checking account type accounts. We have measures in here of labor market regulations, things like minimum wages or severance pay. So in the United States, if you fire someone because maybe they're not very good at their job, you fire them, you don't have to give them any money by law, unless there's a contract. Otherwise, you can just fire them. But in many countries, if you've had an employee for a few years and you want to fire them, you might have to pay them 6 months, 8 months, even a year or more of back pay. You got to pay them a year's salary if you want to get rid of them. Maybe they stole from you, doesn't matter. You're still gonna, you have to pay them that 1 year salary or that 6 month salary to fire them. So severance pay regulations are one of the things we measure. We also measure how long it takes to start a business. Like just start a simple business. In the United States, it's actually not that bad. The World Bank says it takes 30 days to start a simple business. I think it's a warehouse. Like suppose you want to make a warehouse business, trucks drop stuff off, other trucks come pick stuff up, a warehouse. Well, the World Bank says it takes about 30 days to start that business. It's not that hard. You go fill out a few paperwork, maybe at the county courthouse, you're in business. In some countries, it might take a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and like 50 procedures. Like there's 50 pieces of paper you've got to get signed and approved by some government agency before you can start something as simple as a warehouse. Well, actually, we know what happens. What happens in a country where it takes 50 procedures and say 3 or 4 years to start a simple business? Well, no one does it. They either start the business illegally without the official paperwork, or they bribe their way to get the official work done more quickly. So anyway, these are the types of things in this index. It's a lot of data. The data sources are everything from the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, WTO, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. I get some private data from PricewaterhouseCoopers, the private company. World Economic Forum in Switzerland provides data. So we get all this data, we smush it all into my computer, and at the end of the day, we come up with an economic freedom index. And the countries that get the highest scores are the countries that are the most like what Adam Smith wanted it to be. They're the countries that have the smallest governments, the most secure property rights, the soundest money. They give their people the freedom to trade with internet with other people around the world, and they don't burden people with a lot of regulations. So now that we've discussed how we define economic freedom and how we think we're going to go about measuring it, our next job is to look at the measurements themselves, look at the numbers. So who do you think the freest economy is in the world? It's not the United States, although the United States isn't that bad. So we're going to look at the top and bottom 10 countries, we're going to look at some selected other nations, and then we'll maybe pull back and look at the whole world a little bit. We have 165 nations on this Economic Freedom Index, so it's kind of hard to summarize them all at once, but we'll do our best to give you a feel for where countries fall on this Economic Freedom Index. In terms of top and bottom 10, the United States actually comes in 5th. Not too bad. And if you think about the United States, are we a market economy? Yeah, sure. Yeah, we have some taxes, we have regulations, we have some inflation. We have a little bit more inflation lately than we've had in a while, but it's not that bad. We don't have hyperinflation in the United States. Our tax rates aren't as high as they are in other places. So all in all, the United States scores at number 5. The scale is a 0 to 10 scale, so an 8.14 out of 10. The freest economy, though, in the Economic Freedom Index is Singapore. I should mention that this is the first time Singapore has been number 1. These data are for 2021, and this is the first year that Singapore shows up as number 1. In every other previous report, Hong Kong was number 1. So this is the big news for the Economic Freedom Index, is that Hong Kong and Singapore have traded places, although you can see they're essentially tied. Singapore is 8.56, Hong Kong is 8.55. They are very similar countries. They both have really low taxes. I think the top tax rate in both countries is 20%. That's the top tax rate. The top tax rate in the United States, depending on what state you live in, could be as high as 50%. So Singapore and Hong Kong have much lower taxes. Their court systems, for the most part, enforce contracts fairly. They don't have a lot of corruption. They don't have a lot of inflation. They're very free trade countries. In fact, neither country has any tariffs. No tariffs on imported goods at all. So they're the freest trade countries in the world, and their regulations on various things are usually pretty manageable. So Hong Kong and Singapore really stand out. The rest of the countries on the top of the Economic Freedom Index are the kind of countries I think most of us would expect to be there. These are the market economies, the more dynamic, open, competitive market economies like the United States, like Denmark even, Australia, United Kingdom, Canada. At the other end of the scale, we have a lot of countries that, well, for better or worse, you probably would expect to be here as well. Venezuela is dead last, 165 out of 165. It's the lowest rated country that we have. It gets a 3.01 out of 10. I should mention we don't rate North Korea. I'm pretty sure North Korea would be below Venezuela. It would probably be 0.01, not 3.01, 0.01, I don't know, about as low as you can go. We also don't rate Cuba. So Cuba and North Korea are the two countries that are at the very bottom of economic freedom. They're both hard socialist countries. In those countries, taxes and regulations dominate economic life for everybody. They would undoubtedly be at the bottom of this list if we could include them, but we don't have data on North Korea and Cuba, so we don't include them in our index. The World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, none of these organizations provide data for North Korea or Cuba, so they're not in the index. But Venezuela is the lowest country that we're able to score. Then you have a lot of African countries, Zimbabwe on up to other countries, a lot of Islamic countries as well. So these are the bottom countries. Just some of the larger, more significant countries are worth looking at. Again, the US is 5, Venezuela is 165, but some of the larger, more populous nations, Germany's 23, Chile is 30th. Chile is the highest rated Latin American country, which isn't, 30 is not that great, but it's the highest. The next batch of countries, you'll see the colors there. Blue means you're in the top 25%. Green means you're in the second 25%. Yellow is the third quarter, and then red is the bottom quarter. The green countries, you see France, Italy, Mexico, Indonesia. These are countries, when you think of Mexico, when you think of France, what do you think of? Well, I think of a market economy. It's a market economy. It's not socialist. They have private property, but their taxes are really high. The regulations, compared to, say, Great Britain or compared to Germany, their taxes are high, their regulations are more onerous. They're just not as much of a market economy as, say, Germany is, or Japan, or the United States. So you're getting your social welfare countries of Western Europe, mostly, in the sort of green category, that second quarter of countries. The third quarter, the yellows, these are the ones where maybe they're market economies on paper, like they have private property and businesses, but really everything is government dominated. This is where you're getting a lot more corruption. You're seeing that in order to do business in the private sector, you've got to be connected, you've got to be related to the emir or to the president, or you got to get, everything is very politicized. So it may be nominally capitalist in that yellow group, countries like Brazil, India, Russia, China even. These are countries that are nominally free, like market economies now. They have private property and businesses, but really, if you step out of line of the government in these countries, you are in trouble. All right, so these are heavily dominated, but still nominally market economies. And then the red ones are the ones where government risk flat out dominates. You can't do anything. If you want to do anything at all, you've got to be aligned with the government. It's either a hard socialist country like Venezuela is, or it's basically effectively a socialist country. So here's the world map. Let's get you step back a little bit. If you have a favorite country on the map, feel free to identify it. I have some favorite countries on the map. I grew up and became sort of politically aware. I was a student in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was still going on. And one of the greatest things that has ever happened in my life was to witness the breakup, the decline of the Soviet Union. And so for me, the last 30 years or so has been watching the Soviet Union, the constituent parts of the old Soviet Union break apart and kind of go their own way. Some of them really moved away from Soviet-style socialism to pretty good capitalism, pretty good economic freedom. If you look at the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, they're all colored blue on that map, meaning that they're in the top 25%. And also in the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia are both blue. So we have 5 former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Armenia, and they're in the top 25%. 30 years ago, they were Soviet republics. Almost as far away from Adam Smith and his system of natural liberty as you could imagine being. They were Soviet republics. And 30 years later, barely more than a generation later, they are in the top quarter of the most economically free countries in the world. They have all moved very quick towards economic freedom. They've lowered taxes, they've deregulated, they've stabilized their monetary systems, and importantly, they've opened up their markets to the outside world. So that's been great. On the other hand, Russia itself, the big swath that's Russia, of course, yellow is better than red. But Russia has, we all know, has struggled to move towards markets. Yes, they privatized most of the old Soviet enterprises. They're no longer socialist enterprises. They're run by oligarchs. But Russia still has a lot of regulations, a lot of corruption, and they really haven't moved too far away from where they were when they were the Soviet Union. Other countries, Ukraine is doing not very well. Some of the central republics like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, they're kind of middling around too. So, some of the Soviet republics have really barely changed. Others have really changed. And that's been one of the fun things to look at as we look at the economic freedom data over time. The other thing I like to look at is Africa. Africa looks pretty bleak. There's a lot of red. A lot of African countries are in the bottom quarter of the economic freedom index. There isn't a lot of free markets going on in Africa. But it's really not as bad as it looks, because by design, 25% of the countries are going to be red on this map. We've designed the map so that the bottom quarter is always colored red. What's happened, and this is good news, is that countries have all gotten more economically free. I'll show you a graph in a second. But what's happened is that the countries in Africa, which used to be 3s and 4s, are now 5s and 6s. Now, a 5 and a 6 isn't very good, but it's better than a 3 or a 4. So the reds have gotten better. What's happened is that the bottom has kind of come up. There's still a bottom 25%, and it's still mostly in Africa, but they're actually more economically free today than they were, say, 20, 30 years ago. So that's been good news. I'm actually quite optimistic about a lot of African economies. I think once we get through COVID and the world economies begin to reestablish, I think that we're going to see some real growth, particularly in southernish Africa, countries like Botswana, Zambia, Kenya, and so forth, mostly Anglophone, English-speaking Africa especially, but even in some French-speaking Africa, there's been some pretty good reforms. So despite what it looks like on the map, I'm actually optimistic about the prospects in Africa. So what's been happening over the long run? Over the long run, we have seen a general trend towards more economic freedom. I mentioned Africa, but really it's been all around the world. So since 2000, and if you were to do this graph backwards to say 1980, you would see a continuing trend. But since 2000, say the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2021, we've seen a general increase in economic freedom. We have a couple of hiccups. Around 2008 and 2009, there was the financial crisis. Now, the financial crisis itself doesn't really affect economic freedom, but how did governments react to the financial crisis? Well, they spent a lot of money and they added a bunch of new regulations. So the governments reacted to the financial crisis by lowering economic freedom. And then, of course, we have the more recent crisis with respect to COVID in 2020 and 2021. You see this sharp decline from 19 to 20, and then 20 and 21 are about the same. But we see this very sharp decline, even much larger even than we saw during the financial crisis. And of course, how did governments react to COVID? Well, they reacted by spending a lot of money, monetizing it by printing money, and that caused a lot of inflation, and a lot of regulations. One of the regulations we do track in this was travel freedom. Can you freely travel? And of course, freedom to travel, especially from country to country, was severely restricted during COVID. Now, these may have been wise policies as far as public health is concerned. I'm really not here to debate that. But in terms of just economic freedom, all of that new taxation, all that new spending, all the new regulations associated with COVID were definitely decreases in economic freedom. Again, we'll have to wait 10 years and let the scientists settle out whether it was a good idea to do all that stuff or whether we saved lives or didn't save lives. I'm not sure. But economic freedom definitely took a hit. Now, what I'm expecting, of course, in 2022, 2023, I'm expecting to see something like what we saw after the financial crisis. I'm expecting to see the numbers to rebound. Most of the spending, most of the monetary expansion, most of the regulations associated with COVID have been taken away. So I'm expecting the index will rebound. We'll see when the data come in a year or two. So what have we done so far? First of all, we've talked about what economic freedom is and how we might measure it. And then we've talked about the measurements. So now that we know the numbers, we know that Venezuela is the least economically free and Singapore is the most economically free. Our next job will be to discuss what it all means. What does it mean to be more economically free, and what does it mean to be less economically free? Let's start off by talking about the relationship between economic freedom and income per capita. I mean, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And he said in The Wealth of Nations that the wealth of the nation will be higher, will be richer, if we have a system of natural liberty, or what today I'm going to call economic freedom. So we have data now. We have data on economic freedom from the Economic Freedom Index. We have countries that are very low in freedom, bottom 25%, the red countries. Then we get the blue countries, the countries that have the most economic freedom. And we get the yellows and the greens, they're somewhere in the middle. And we have data on how rich the country is, GDP per capita, income per capita. You get this from the World Bank. It's adjusted for purchasing power. It's the best measure we have of standard of living across countries. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good measure. If you look at the red countries, the countries with the least amount of economic freedom in the world, countries like Venezuela, and you average the income across the red countries, the bottom quarter of economic freedom, what you see is income is about $6,000, a little over $6,000 per person. As you go to the yellow countries, the next group, the second least free group, it doubles to around, more or less doubles to around $12,000. If you go from yellow to green, green is sort of the upper middle class for economic freedom, then the sort of economically free, but not really that economically free. It doubles again to $25,000. And then when you go from the green to the blue, you go from the second most economically free group to the most economically free group, you more or less double again. So wow, Adam Smith was right. The jury is in. Adam Smith was right. You know, Karl Marx, though, would not have looked at that graph and been surprised either. Because Karl Marx actually did know that capitalism, or that's what he called it, capitalism, free markets, he knew that they produced a lot of wealth. Actually, Karl Marx had long passages in his writings about how productive capitalism was, how much stuff, how much income, how much GDP it could produce. The big complaint that Karl Marx had, and people to this day still have, was what? Well, yeah, capitalism produces a lot of stuff. Economic freedom produces a lot of GDP per capita, but it all goes to the rich, right? The problem with economic freedom, according to Marx and Marxists, is the lack of equality. So let's take a look at some data on the poorest 10% of the population and ask what share of the income, what percentage of income. So if you have 100% of the population, let's ignore the top 90%, just look at the bottom 10%. The bottom 10th. What share of income do the people in the bottom 10% receive? Well, I have bad news. Not a lot. That's what it kind of means to be in the bottom 10%. But if you'll notice, if you're in a red country, which is, say, a low economic freedom country, yellow, green, or blue, a high economically free country, looks like somewhere between 2.5%, a little bit lower, a little higher, 2 to 3% of income is being earned by the bottom 10% of the population. It's not a lot. And a lot of people look at that income inequality that we have in this world and they're outraged. They're shocked and outraged. But if you ask the question, is it caused by economic freedom? Are the countries that follow Adam Smith's system of natural liberty, the countries with the lowest taxes and the least regulations and the soundest monetary policies and the freest trade, are those countries the ones with the most inequality? And the answer is no. The countries that regulate a lot, the countries that have high taxes, the countries with the worst monetary systems, by worst I mean the most unstable monetary systems, those countries also have a lot of inequality. There's a lot of inequality in the world. And it seems to be everywhere. It's higher if you look at individual countries, yes, it's higher in some, lower in others, but it doesn't seem to correlate at all with the kind of economic system you have. This is disappointing. I wish I could tell you how we can fix income inequality. A lot of people are concerned about income inequality. They would like to see a world that was more equal. I just don't really have a great solution for you, but I do know something. I do know that the economic system that you have, whether it's socialist or capitalist or anything in between, doesn't seem to drive income inequality much one way or the other. Now, with that said, where would you rather be in the bottom 10% of a country? In an economically free country or in a not economically free country? Well, the answer is going to speak for itself, I think, when you look at the graph. This is the income level. It's not the share of income, it's the actual level of income that is received by the bottom 10% on average in the red, yellow, green, and blue buckets for economic freedom. The least economically free countries in the world, the average person in the bottom 10% of that population has about $1,700, a few bucks a day. In the blue countries, it's $14,000 per person. That's not a lot of money. If you have $14,000 a year in income in the United States, you are poor. But I'd rather be poor and have $14,000 than poor and have $1,700. So it's unambiguously the case that the poorest of the poor, the bottom of the income distribution, is better off if they're in a blue and therefore richer nation. The philosopher John Rawls, famous philosopher, spent his career at Harvard, probably the most important philosopher of the 20th century, he said you should judge a country by how well it treats the bottom of the bottom, how well it treats the poorest of the poor. Well, if I'm judging countries based on this, which is how well we're treating the poorest of the poor when it comes to income, my judgment would have to be that the blue economically free countries are the more socially just countries, to use the term that John Rawls used. Now, another way of looking at this is poverty data. Poverty data come from the World Bank. The World Bank gives us data on how many people live on certain amounts a day. It's per day. So there's three levels. $2.15 a day, $3.65 a day, or $6.85 a day. What percentage of the population lives on that much or less a day? Well, in the red countries, 32% of the population has less than $2 a day in earnings. 74% have less than $6.85 a day. Feel free to multiply by 365 to see what that turns out to be for a year, but that's a lot of people living on not very much. Whereas again, in the blue countries, the countries with the most economic freedom, you have somewhere between 1 to 5% of the population, between 1 out of 100 to maybe 1 out of 20 people at most, who are living in that kind of level of abject poverty. So a lot less poverty going on in the more economically free countries. Again, if you're a Rawlsian, if you want to think about how we're treating the poorest of the poor, this seems to be evidence in favor of economic freedom. And then the last one I want to talk about is social progress in a more general, broad sense. I could throw up another dozen graphs with infant mortality, environmental quality, women's rights. I have all this, we have a lot of data in this world. There's a group called the Social Progress Initiative, and what the Social Progress Initiative does is they do an index of social progress. It's very much like my Economic Freedom Index. My Economic Freedom Index is trying to measure economic freedom. Their Social Progress Index is trying to measure social progress, and they have in that index something like 60 variables for things like how clean is the environment, how healthy are the people, what's infant mortality, how clean is the water. So they put a lot of variables about social and economic outcomes. They don't put anything in there about GDP per capita, so it's not a measurement of how rich we are. It's just a measure of how we're doing in terms of, well, what they call social progress, but more generally is social and environmental progress situations. Well, they have a 100-point scale on their index, and it's 0 to 100, and good news, economic freedom works here too. So suppose you don't care about income. Suppose income, GDP per capita, that's just what economists care about. I care about, infant mortality. I care about the environment. I care about women's rights. I care about these social goals. Well, there isn't a conflict between economic freedom and social progress measured by these sort of softer measures either. The best measurement we have of social progress, I think, is the Social Progress Index. And it turns out that countries with more economic freedom also have more social progress. So the last thing I want to do is a little bit of a plug. We have a website. Our publisher is the Fraser Institute, which is a think tank in Canada. Our website is fraserinstitute.org/economic-freedom. Although if you just Google that, you'll probably get to the same place. And on that website, we've got all the data. I mentioned that we have data back to 1970 for many countries. So if you wanted to look at long time trends, if you're a student who's doing work in a class and you're supposed to do a report about Venezuela or any country or whatever, the data are all available, all the Excel spreadsheets. There's a lot of maps. The maps are animated. It's very cool. So I invite you to go check out our website at the Fraser Institute if you want to learn more. So what have we discussed? We've learned how economic freedom can be measured, what economic freedom means. We've learned which countries are the most free and which countries are the least free. And we've learned what it means to be more or less economically free. I want to thank you for listening to my talk about economic freedom of the world. Thank you.